My name is Olen Gardiner, and I couldn't tell you what I do because I've been in 14 separate and distinct occupations and professions, and that would take all night, and you don't have that much time.
Well, I noticed there's a lot of instruments behind you. Is there something perhaps that you do in connection with some sort of bluegrass or old time music that might be pertinent here?
Yeah, I got an early start in that realm of experience. Uh, my dad was struck by automobile and killed when I was 4 years old, and we were raised very poor on the top of a mountain, and we had to more or less forage for our food and existence. But down at the bottom of the mountain was Mount Airy, North Carolina, and all Mama's people were down there, and they had things like bathrooms and refrigerators. An ice cube was one of the greatest things I could ever get when we went down to visit. The kids also had toys, and store-bought toys laying all over the place, and I wanted one of those toys so badly, but I had too much mountain pride to ask for it. So I'd go home, and we had trees, we had lots of wood, we had saws and knives, and I'd start carving out my little cars and little pistols, and coloring them and putting little wheels on them and such like. And now I'm going to jump forward about 60 years to a time when an evangelist came by here and wanted me to repair his guitar. He'd heard about me. And he started asking me questions. How did you learn this art of luthiery and so on? And I said, God blessed me to be poor. And I saw right away that I needed to explain myself to him. And I went back and I said, during that period of time, as I was a child, I also learned how to make my musical instruments. First banjo was a little wooden cigar box with a carved neck on it, and the strings, you call them wires. They were wires out of screen doors or hairs out of horses' tails and so on. And my other older brothers was also building their own banjos or instruments, so I was in the environment for that. I had to do it right inside the house. The little house didn't have any shops or anything, so I could watch in the winter time when they were working on the instruments, and that's how I learned to work on that. And that's been a part of my life all my life, playing and working on instruments, building, and so on.
Okay, so are there any other musicians in your family?
Uh, Practically everybody played something, just in a very insignificant way, just not real serious musicians, just play a few tunes on the banjo, the fiddle, somebody would square dance a little bit or something, that kind of, but not any serious career musician, anything like that.
But most people played at least a little bit of music.
Yeah, practically everybody did. Pick up something, play a tune, lay it down,
Right. So your parents, your grandparents, it's sort of a long tradition of music that goes back, or it's more your generation?
Well, not on my father's side. They were serious preachers, very serious preachers who did not condone, I suppose, string music. But on my mother's side, there was, in fact, my mom was quite old when I was born. I came in one day, and she was playing a tune on one of my banjos, and I didn't know Mom could do that. And I asked her about it. She said, yeah, I could play pretty well when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. And said one day I was sitting in the swing playing my brother's banjo, and said something knocked me out of the swing. And I looked around, and my mother, she had a large stick, and she had knocked me out of the swing, me and the banjo, and she said, nice girls don't play banjos. So there was a lot of strict, hard-nosed beliefs in the. So I guess that stopped Mama's banjo playing. But she could still, believe it or not, and they'd probably been 50 or 60 years, she could still play a tune pretty good.
Did you tell her nice girls play banjos now? She could pick it back up when you heard about
I
that?
tried to get her to.
Yeah, you say. And so I guess when you were first learning how to play music, how did you learn? I mean, did you learn from books or from, how did you?
I had never seen a guitar. Obviously, I had heard guitars on the old records, and finally we got a radio so Mama could listen to the World War II news, and I managed to sneak a little Grand Ole Opry or something occasionally when she didn't know about it. But this, other than by ear, and never have. I saw banjos and fiddles, of course. That was all we had. That was all there was in our area, but not guitar. So I decided I wanted a guitar, and I was 13 years old, and I told Mom, I said, I want a guitar. Sears and Roebuck just came out with one. The World War II was over, and they were starting to produce instruments again. Virtually everybody stopped during the war. If it wasn't because of scarcity of materials, it was because of respect for the war. You know, everybody felt like they needed to be in a somber mood during World War II. So Mama said, well, there's only one way you can get one. Said, there's a piece of land and here's some seed beans. Said, you can raise you a patch of beans this summer, sell them late summer, and if you get enough money, you can order you a guitar. $14.95 from Sears and Roebuck. So I raised a patch of beans and I sold them at the market, and I ordered myself a guitar. And I couldn't wait for the rural mailman to deliver it. And one day he set the old cardboard box out, and I went running up. I opened the box right at the mailbox. Opened it up, there was a little instruction book, told me how to tune it. I followed that and I tuned it. There were chord diagrams, show you where to set your fingers. That seemed to be easy enough. The thing I didn't know was how to play it, because it didn't tell you whether to strum or to pick or what to do. But my sister-in-law, who was married to my older brother before I was ever born, and she played a fiddle, she came by that evening, and I saw her strum that guitar, and I was off and running. Within a week, I was playing all the old Carter family songs. Within a week, because they were embedded in my ear, in my mind, and in my heart. And so that's how I started on the guitar. Still, at that time, I'd never seen anyone play a guitar.
You'd heard it a lot on the radio, though?
Heard it on the radio. Didn't really know about guitar.
What were some people that you obviously the Carter family, was there any other shows or programs or people that you really were influenced by back then on the radio? Or?
Bill Monroe was on the opera as early as 1940, probably before that. Yeah, I think he went 38, but anyway, to me it was 1940 that I heard him, and Uncle Dave Macon and his jug band, his band of Son Darce and all that group that went with him. And that's about it. Carter family, of course. That was pretty much my, and then we had old records of Charlie Poole and Grayson and Whitter and all the old Vernon Dalhart and all the old stuff, and stacks of old records there when I was a child, so I could listen to those. So,
like you were saying that, well, I guess we could start with this question. So, how do you think music really functioned? What was the function of music back in or Appalachian days back in the day?
It was a social lubrication. People didn't talk much, but they'd play their instruments. You'd get things started. It had a stigma with it too, the alcohol, and there was some of that strong resentment in my family. Case in point, I was pretty proud of myself when I got hired by Charlie Monroe to go off and play on television stations and do shows and everything. I might as well have gone to prison as far as my people were concerned. I just walked.
You signed your life away.
Yeah, I was gone. And even when we came back in the neighborhood to do a show, none of them. And even when we appeared on local TV shows, they wouldn't watch those.
They couldn't watch you going down that wicked path of sin.
Wicked path of sin. And the good musicians around home, the ones that really could play good, would just get sloppy drunk, and they stereotyping what it was, But and then I played one of my early gigs was in Baltimore, Maryland nightclubs. We had Earl Taylor on the mandolin. We had Charlie Waller played with us some. He was a young fellow back then. Art Wooten, the fiddle player, and Boat Whistle, and they'd been with Flat Scruggs and different ones. But those bars, they were alcohol places, and some of the musicians were really hooked with alcohol and stuff. But it never bothered me. I never wanted it. I remember a lot of our livelihood came out of the tip bucket, and people would come up and want to buy you a drink, and if you accept a drink from them, then they'd tip you. If you refused their drink, they'd kind of become insulted and walk off. So tip money was pretty important. So I devised a tub and a little hose and a funnel down below where they couldn't see it, and I'd fake these drinks. Sometimes it'd be 3 or 4 inches deep in that tub of a night. But
Now, how did you do that? How'd that work out?
well, it just, you know. And,
where was the hose? Where was the tub? So it was behind the chair or
well,
something?
you could only see us from a waist up. They had a scene painted back behind us. You could only see it from, what's it was easy to do. You know, had a funnel just below the line of sight and a little rubber hose running down there. But my family didn't know but what I was just wallowing in sin up there. I was trying to start a musical career. I was interested in that and wanted to do that. And some of the fellows in the group liked the bar too much.
Have you seen, and what are the ways you have seen some of the traditional music, like you were saying, how the music functioned in the traditional Appalachian families on porches and families and social functions? How did it change, or how has it changed over the years to become a successful business and industry, do you think?
Well, I know, particularly what's called bluegrass. It didn't have a name when I played it. It was billed as hillbilly music. Particularly that has been, you know, commercialized, and I realize there's a lot of superstars that are making great money and all that. I don't know how it got there. It had to be some good promoters, and I know back in the days of early when Flat and Scruggs started getting really superstars, there was a lot of good breaks, like the Hollywood, the movie contracts and things that put this music in a worldwide audience, nationwide and then worldwide, and so forth. It remained canned up in a local area for a long, long time, and very few people made money off of it.
That area being?
Well, I kind of have to go by the territory we worked. We worked West Virginia, Southern Indiana, Southern Ohio, Central and Eastern Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, Southwestern Virginia, North and South Carolina, certain portions, and there's kind of a region there that you know that I knew about.
Okay, so what are some ways that you've seen, or that you think Appalachian music has been able to survive into modern times? What have you seen as major forces that have helped to preserve that music?
What major factors have helped preserve it? Well, first of all, I think that it's a communicable disease. And once you get the bug, you'll starve if you have to in order to play it. Of course, if you can make money, that's good, you know. But I mean, it's a compelling thing, you know. It gets in your blood, you know. You want to play, you got to play it. So I think that's the strongest element. And of course, there have been people who've been promoters who've been kind and like we said, you know, put it out there in front of, toss it out in front of the ears of people all over the country and all over the world. And I'm amazed at this old time music. I still judge several fiddlers conventions around, and some of the finest old time music I ever heard right now is coming out of areas like Philadelphia. And I asked myself, I said, how did it get out? It's never been commercialized. You go back to Kingston Trio and the Lamplighters where they strummed on a banjo. That was a different kind of thing. It was a strumming of a banjo, and the Seegers may have helped in different things. I don't know, but I don't think to this day that the old time music is a big commercial commodity. People play it because they love it, I think.
So how did you first enter into the realm of professional musicianship?
Well, what I classify as professional is a person who makes their livelihood at that single effort. And I left home, and I had a wife and a little daughter. But I got married early at 18. So about age 19, I left, not that far from my family, went into Mountaineer, North Carolina, quit my job as an automotive mechanic, and went to working for Uncle Joe Johnson full time, playing music. and went from there to Baltimore, Maryland, and then back down here, and then from there with Charlie Monroe for 2 years, 56 and 57. And at that time, my little daughter was getting older and needed me, and I decided, and I became a Christian in that period of time, a believer, and the church that I united with had a piano player, and I started singing bass in a quartet, and got completely away from the strings for 10 full years, and pastored churches and different things. Helped build the inertial guidance system for the Apollo program, put the man on the moon, did all kinds of interesting things. And in 1967, I decided I had a reissue of my interest, and I wanted a good banjo, and you couldn't buy a good banjo. Nobody was building a good banjo. And I had access, because of my employment, to the finest of machine shops and anything that I wanted to use on my own time, and materials and commodities. So I started building a few real good banjos. And when I did, I wanted to share that somewhere. That desire took me back out there. So I went to the World's Championship in Union Grove, North Carolina, and took one of my banjos and played and won the World Championship 1957. And on the banjo, and the band that I went with, which was called the Dixie Ramblers, that's the same year we played for Queen Elizabeth at Jamestown for the 350th birthday of the United States. And things just started clicking for me in the music world again. But I never again left home and traveled and played for a living. Never again. In 1968, I became the director down at the World Championship in Union Grove, North Carolina, and that's where I met Doc Watson. He was coming down there, and we became friends, played some together, did a few shows, even one at the Civic Center down in Salem, and a few things. Merle was learning to play, and had a good relationship with him. And then in '71, we got invited to the National Festival in Vienna. Went up there and did a week with Vassar Clemens and a group like that. And then in '74, we got invited to do a little stint with Tom T. Hall. And in the meantime, I'd changed wives and found out that my new wife, Frances, had a wonderful voice. Had a terrible struggle with one of the Grand Ole Opry people to keep him from pulling her away from me. I said I wanted a wife, not a singing star. And I won't call whose name that is, but he went on to Missouri, moved on out a little. So all these years, it's been just casual associations. Now, back to another thing. A lot of things go on simultaneously. Buddy Pendleton and I and my second wife, Frances, we formed a group called the Appalachian Ramblers. And in must have been in the 70s somewhere. And then Jack Hanshelwood started playing guitar with us, and he played guitar with us 17 years. And so we booked pretty nice places all around in the areas, weekend things. Everybody held their jobs and stayed with their families, that kind. A lot of musicians do that now, but years ago they didn't do it that way. We had recorded local people, and I've got one of our CDs here that you might like to have, around Mount Airy, North Carolina, WPAQ. In fact, nearly everybody in the business was down there at the time. Mac Wiseman was down there, Flatt and Scruggs, Carter and Ralph Stanley. And, we just all associated, So that was where things began to happen, was in Mount Airy, North Carolina. And I only lived 13 miles from there. My home up on top of Fancy Gap Mountain down, so very convenient to go to Mount Airy. And Galax, there was a lot of radio, local live radio programs in Galax, and there was one in Hillsville. So it was just my neighborhood there, local bands and all.
So how did you hook up with Charlie Monroe?
I was working as an automotive mechanic in Hillsville at the Ford place. Again, I went back and forth between music and automotive mechanic, the only trade I had learned at that point in time. And I was at the Ford garage in Hillsville. I didn't have a phone. You didn't have things like that. My sister-in-law called me from Fancy Gap, said, Charlie Monroe is at Mount Airy, North Carolina at the radio station, and they've been advertising all day long for you to come down there. One thing that might have led to this, not long before that, Bill Monroe came to Mount Airy and found himself a banjo player, and that was Rudy Lyle. And I guess Charlie thought, well, he needed to come to Mount Airy. And he was passing through and heard some of our music on the radio that I said a minute ago we'd recorded. So he stayed there all day. Well, I went rushing down there and I almost missed him. He was getting in his car to leave. That's how close I came of never playing with Charlie Monroe. And so he puts the pawn out real fast, you know. He asked me 2 or 3 questions about my domestic situation to determine if I was eligible and dependable to go off on the road, you know, and leave family and all that. And I knew how to answer those questions to his desire, and I answered them in the way that I knew he would want me to. And next comes the thing of salary. Well, this was 1955, 56. This was February, 1st of February, 56. I was making $45 a week as an automotive mechanic. And I was right close to my brother, who was service manager, making 50. So I was making almost top notch. That'd be equivalent to about, I'd say, $450, $500 a week now for a top notch Ford mechanic. And so Charlie brought up salary. And he said, how much will you have to go with me? I said, how about $100 a week? And he said, I'll give you $90 a week and pay your hotel bills. We had to live in hotels. And I acted very reluctant and finally accepted, you know. Doubling for auto mechanic, something I wanted to do, you know. But he was hard to get along with, and he cursed a lot, and he was very abusive privately. I put up with that for a good long while. And then I refer you to the article in Bluegrass Unlimited of October 1979, when someone finally wrote about that big fight that Charlie and I almost had. It was quite a scene, but after that there was no more cursing, and we got along.
Now, what was that? What's the real dirt on that story there, if you don't?
Well,
you can tell us.
Finally one night, try to make a long story short, not much way to do it. Finally one night, he cursed me because I wouldn't get out of the way where his admirers were coming backstage, and there wasn't anywhere for me to go really but out in the snow. It was a wintertime thing. And I was so upset that I didn't play well that night, and it was really bothering me. And so when he stopped, he had a Cadillac limousine, a pink Cadillac limousine, and the trailer that we pulled, Audrey Williams, Hank Williams had given it to Charlie. They were good friends. They became good friends down at Shreveport, Louisiana, at the Louisiana Hayride prior to that time. And so Audrey gave Charlie this trailer. So we carried our sound equipment, our instruments in the trailer. So that night, Charlie stopped at Fancy Gap to let me out. He lived in the hotel in Mount Airy, North Carolina. He stopped to let me out. And of course, the 56 Cadillac had power windows. And in his driver's seat, he just let down the power window, and he'd hand me the keys. And I'd go back to the trailer and unlock the door and get my banjo out and fasten the door and come back, hand him the keys, and he'd roll the power window up, and he'd go down the mountain to Mount Airy. Well, that night, he handed me the keys, and I stuck them in my pocket, his car keys. And I said, Charlie, there's something we've got to settle. Now, he was a big man, and he and Bill used to offer to fight anybody that wanted to fight him as part of the sport, part of the show they put on. He said they were never whipped. He was much of a man, a strong, huge man. And I was just out of high school. We boxed a little in high school, but I learned a little bit about self-defense, I guess. Hope I did. Managed to survive anyway. And so I knew there's going to be a big fight because there's only 2 ways you could settle anything with a Monroe. And there's two legitimate ways you could settle anything with a Monroe. You could shut your mouth and do what you were told and keep quiet, or you'd have a fight, and then whoever won the fight, then that's the way you settled it. So it had to be one of the two, and I knew that. I knew the Monroes very well. I spent several weekends in the Monroe territory down in Louisa and Beaver Dam, Kentucky, because I'd go in with Charlie on weekends, sometimes when we didn't have shows. Getting back to the story, here he comes, you know, and I went back to the trailer and unlocked, got my banjo out. I had Charlie Poole's old original master tone, and I hated to break it over his head, you know, but that possibility did cross my mind. It was a big snow on, and he was overweight, and he had on leather bottom slippers, and he was standing on slick snow, and I had on cheap rubber bottom boots, and I messed around there, and I finally got my feet on good solid gravels. And if you know anything about fighting, you know that a lot of it comes out of the power of your legs and your feet. You know, you got to have a good stance. You can't hurt anybody with your arms. Not really. I mean, you might irritate them a little. Okay, so I sized up all that. Well, here's what happened, though. I was talking to him, telling him I really didn't call him back there to fight him, because if he get one lick in on you or get a hold of you, he'd kill you. And I knew that. And I wasn't very comfortable. Now, I'll tell you, I was not very comfortable. But I was trying to get my point across that I had never been cursed, never had been raised up for that, and I didn't accept it, and I was not going to accept it. I guess ultimately I was just going to quit him, probably. But I was talking. Well, here's what Charlie did. It was cold. It was in the wintertime. Snow on the ground, as I said. He pulls his hat off and lays it up on the trailer. And I keep talking. He pulls his overcoat off and folds it real nicely and carefully, lays it up on the trailer. He pulls his suit coat off and folds it real nicely, takes his time, lays it up on the trailer. He takes his necktie off and folds it very carefully, lays it up on the trailer, and rolls his sleeves up. And his arm big around my legs, black hair all over him, scars on him. Now he's ready. But instead of fighting, and I don't know if that cold winter air had gotten to him and cooled him off, or if something I had said made him realize that all I wanted was the cussing to stop, whatever that required. I don't know what, but he reached out, took my hand, and said, well, we'll see if we can't get along a little better from now on. And he got all that stuff in his arms, got back in his car, and went on down the mountain. And that was the end of the cursing. We got along like two normal human beings after that.
Well, that's a great story.
Something happened that I don't remember what in the summer of '56, and he went on off somewhere, and I stayed at home. And then in October of '56, I went back with him. In the meantime, I had gone to work in the hosiery mill in Mount Airy, North Carolina, and he came back to Mount Airy, and he and his wife Betty and their little dog would be outside the hotel of the evening when we went up second shift to get our evening meal from the hosiery mill. And he approached me to go back with him, and I went back with him again through the fall, winter, and the spring of '57. And in '57, and that relates to that new CD I released last year, because I had gotten my buddies jobs with Charlie Monroe then, Wayburn Johnson, Walter Dawson, all local Mount Airy boys, lifetime friends. We were all working with Charlie by the spring of '57. And Charlie wanted to go to Canada. And by that time, he paid differently. We were on 10% of the gate, each musician. And I was booking his shows, making another 10%, so I was drawing 20% off the gate. Still, we're making good money. We have done shows, I got to jump in and say this, we have done shows where, well, normally we did 2 shows. People would stand and wait for the second show, but we have done shows where there would be 3 shows. People would stand and wait for the 3rd show. That's how big he was. And he was the only man I could have gone with, because nobody else could afford to pay any wages worth anything. He supported Bill a lot, loaned him money all the time. Bill Monroe, brother. I overheard conversations. I know that for a fact. So economically, there was no one else I could have ever played with.
So how often did you guys see Bill then? I mean,
We didn't see Bill very often, but I would overhear Charlie and his wife sometimes in conversation where he had loaned Bill money, and Charlie's wife wasn't very pleased with it. And sometimes I would overhear those kind of conversations, especially when I went down to Beaver Dam to their home to spend the night. They had in the hallway there was just a central heating grate, and you had to leave your bedroom doors open in the cold wintertime if you wanted any heat at all, so you could get some heat out of the hallway. So I'd hear them talking late at night, a lot of times, different things that I heard. But Charlie wanted to go to Canada, and Wayburn, Johnson, Walter Dalton, like I say, there was three of us. We pretty well had a power block, and we was afraid he wasn't well known in Canada, paying on percentage, and somebody talked him into going up there. We was afraid we'd starve, and it was in cold. I don't know, but that time it might have been about March '57, cold, bad weather, and cold in Canada, and he's bad to fire people, and we just felt insecure, and we didn't want to go to Canada. And he held his temper. And one night we did 2 big shows down in North Carolina, and he didn't finish paying us. He'd always been very honest with us. He said, well, he was going to Beaver Dam, Kentucky for the weekend, back home place. See y'all Monday morning. Monday morning came, we had an early morning radio show in Mount Airy, WPAQ, no Charlie Monroe. And I said a minute ago I was booking the shows. Wednesday night, we had a 7 o'clock live TV show on Channel 10 in Roanoke, Virginia, no Charlie Monroe. Well, I knew exactly what to do. I canceled everything. All the shows I had booked up, and the engagements at Channel 12 in Winston-Salem and everything.
What had happened?
He got mad and left, and just left us all there. And about 4 weeks before that, I heard him on the telephone talking. He liked to have electric guitar, and there was a good one up in New York State that he knew from somewhere, and he called him. His name was Buddy Hyman. Buddy and his wife Janice. Janice was real pregnant. Got him quit his job, come to Mount Airy. And that Saturday night when he flew mad but silently left and didn't come back, there sat Buddy and Janice with no money and her real pregnant. Never said a word to them, never said a word to anybody. Now, 17 years goes by. In the meantime, Charlie's wife died with cancer. Sick a long time. They lost everything they had. They'd been very wealthy. He even sold his D45 guitar. And that's a story I'd like to share with I'm going to share it with Martin Guitar. You know, I work for Martin Guitar. I have for years. I'm going to share it with them one day in their magazine. But 17 years goes by. In the meantime, I've got a new wife. And I see a poster in Christiansburg, Virginia. Charlie Monroe and his Kentucky partners. I said, what? It's after 17 years. So I told Francis, I said, let's go. Christiansburg High School, let's go. It's the show. Well, I said, he may be arrogant, he may not remember me. I said, we'll just buy tickets and go in and sit down. Well, we walked in, and it was a few minutes before the show, and he was standing up near the stage. And he saw us come in, and he came running down that aisle like a turkey trotting, grabbed my hand, almost shook it off my shoulder, called me by my first name. He never did do that. That's why I never got any fame. He'd say, back 56 and 57, he'd say, well, let's get this boy up here now to play one on the banjo. This boy, you know, he never would call names. Called me by my name, picked Frances up, went around and around with her, said, you pretty little old chink and pan-eyed thing, you're prettier than you ever was. Both of my wives had brown eyes, and he thought it was my first wife.
Whoops.
So, and when he did his show that night, he had a lot of nice things to say about me. And I was in industrial engineering management position with Ingersoll Rand at that time in Roanoke. My secretary, one day, following week, one day she said, this call was coming in. It doesn't sound like one of your business clients. It's a strange call. Hand me the phone. He said, talk fast, you know. He said, what you doing Saturday night? I said, oh, nothing. He said, how about bringing a banjo and come to North Wilkesboro, North Carolina? I said, got a good show down there. I said, help me do a good show. I said, well, okay. Now, it had been 17 years. Well, I take Francis and get babysitters for our children. Both had small children. And I take a road map of North Carolina and Virginia, and I set my compass on 150 miles, and I make a 300-mile diameter circle with Christiansburg being the center, knowing that I would never quit my job, knowing I had little children to look after and all my obligations. I think I was pastoring the church then. I had several churches I pastored. And I put that map in my hip pocket, and like I say, I knew how to deal with the Monroes. Got down to North Wilkesboro, North Carolina, went in, tuned up, walked out on the stage, smooth as silk. He had never changed one iota of his material. And I had practiced with him all in 56 and 57. I sung bass on all the hymns and played the five-string banjo and so on. And the program was as smooth as silk because I knew every move he was going to make. One thing you had to do, you had to watch his capo because he'd get it one fret higher or lower.
Oh,
you had to keep
God.
your eyes on his capo. You really had to watch his capo.
I hate that.
So backstage, he said, in the meantime, here's what had happened to Charlie. Jimmy Martin and Carlton Haney had gone together and gotten Charlie and his second wife, he'd recently remarried, and they were both penniless, and moved them to North Carolina. Can't think that won't come to me. Moved them in a little white house down there and was featuring Charlie on some of the bluegrass shows. So he had a lot of shows booked around, and people were still coming out real good to see him. And I just pulled that map out of my pocket when he approached me about going with him, and I said, here's what I can do, and here's how far I can go without being away from my family or interfering with my job or other thing. I said, I can meet you at all these places and play with you. Oh, that was fine, that was fine. I said, I can't go any further than this. 2 shows he had outside that realm, and one of them was in the Atlanta, Georgia area. That was okay. He didn't even mention it. The other was in Maryland. And the Library of Congress filmed, and they got the Monroe brothers back together, Bill and Charlie, for the one time only. And he didn't even mention it to me because it was outside that circle. That's where the Monroes are. He hired a banjo picker by the name of Porter Church. I don't know if you ever heard of him.
Yeah,
Used to be around, to go up there and do that show. I would have given anything in the world to have gone up there and been documented in that with them.
But it's outside your circle.
That's outside the
You should have
circle.
said, I guess, in hindsight, unless you get something really good like a reunion with your brother, and in that case, I'll go outside the circle.
But Charlie developed Parkinson's, Hodgkin's disease of the lymph nodes, lymphomia cancer, and he got very sick, and we still stayed with him right to the end, and he died in 1975. But in the meantime, in 1974, we did get to cut one album together on Pine Tree Records. And I think I'm going to re-release that one day on a CD or some of it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Can you discuss how you think fiddlers' conventions have affected or influenced the traditional music?
Well, I ought to be able to, as many of them as I've managed and directed and judged and so forth. But you know, I don't know. I don't have definitive thoughts on that. I know that competition promotes perfection, or trying to do better. It uplifts abilities. People will practice and practice and practice. Yeah, I thought of something. Maybe this will help. This is going to sound like the biggest lie and the biggest bragging thing ever was, but it's the gospel truth. I beat the man 3 times that beat Earl Scruggs twice in the banjo picking contest.
Well, that's pretty darn impressive. Who's that?
That is a fact.
Who
Well,
was it?
the banjo picker's name was Larry Richardson. You ever heard of him? He played with Bill Monroe.
Played with him.
Yeah, they going to re-release some of their stuff. He played with Bill Monroe for a period of time. Before that, the Lonesome Pine Fiddlers. And he was a good banjo player and good high tenor singer. And I heard him say he had beat Darryl Scruggs in a couple of contests, but I somehow couldn't find it in my heart to believe he was telling the truth. So I just let it go in one ear and out the other. Well, Larry would come to my house and work out stuff on the 5-string banjo, and I'd strum the guitar with him. In the meantime, I acquired a 5-string banjo, but Larry was a big guy, had been on the Grand Ole Opry and the Bill Monroe and all this, and I felt real small around him, so I didn't let him know I had a banjo. But I'd play the guitar with him, he'd work on stuff. Well, before he'd get his car out of my driveway, I'd have my banjo out from under the bed, because I'd watched him so intently that I was doing everything he was doing, and he never knew it. So it came to a head at a fiddlers convention in Hillsville, Virginia, at the VFW. I went up and I invented levers, not tuning pegs, but levers on the banjo where I could hit both of them, go from G to D, back and forth, sound like a steel guitar. Mm-hmm. And I had my levers on there, and I went up to Fancy Gap, 8 miles away. It was my hometown, Hillsville, entered the contest. Larry walks in and says, how about getting you to play guitar with me? I said, well, it might disqualify us. What do you mean? I said, I've entered the banjo. And he said, you what? So I had to tell him I was playing banjo. Well, it so happened that I won that night. It may have been the gimmickry of my, they call them rabbit ears on the TV later on, and people write in and want to see me work my rabbit ears. It may have been the gimmickry because I certainly was not the quality musician that Larry Richardson was. I was just a beginner, just a youngster. Well, I won, and he showed a bad side of personality that night. He complained publicly, that place was crooked and it was my hometown and all this. He said, just wait till I catch you up at Galax. Well, that was in May, and I had June, July, I had about 2.5 months to practice it. And you know how fast a kid can come up on something. They learn something. And I was a kid. And I took his version of John Henry, which is the best I've ever heard anybody play it, including Earl Scruggs. And I went to Galax and I played John Henry, and it so happened that he had won the year before and had the crowd just all excited about, like Sarah Palin does people now. And I happened to win up there, and he showed a bad personality again.
Now, you won doing his licks?
Yeah, I played his.
Of course he had a bad personality.
I played his John Henry. I mean, I'd watched him so much, but I have really polished it up, And, a kid can do that. I was a kid, really.
How old were you?
I was probably 18, I don't know.
Oh, man.
17, 18, something like that. Now, he goes off that night and he says, boy, if I ever catch you away from here, and of course he lived as close to Galax as I did. We was both 8 or 10 miles originally from the town of Galax. If I ever catch you away from here, you'll see, and so on, and I just wilted, I was astounded by all that. Well, they had a banjo picking contest in the Tobacco Warehouse in Martinsville, Virginia, and they called it the District Championship Playoff. They had 17 banjo pickers down there who had won different places. Well, I got invited, winning at Galax and Union Grove. Down there was Eddie Johnson out of the Four Little Hillbillies. There was Earl Scruggs' nephew, Hubert Davis, Larry Richardson. Banjo pickers had won Watermelon Park, different all over the country. 17 banjo pickers. And Jim Eames was one of the judges. By the way, I've got Jim's guitar.
Oh, do you?
Jim Eames was one of the judges, and Mr. Kreitz that owned the Douglas Battery Factory out of Winston-Salem. It had something to do with music, and some professor of music was the 3 judges. And not only did I win, but they made a speech about my banjo playing and why they thought, I had come in. Yeah, they came out. There was a woman. I don't know who she was now, but came out and talked about my unusual talent and so on. Well, I won down there, and Larry didn't speak to me for 13
Were
years.
you still doing his licks though? Were you still?
I played John Henry again. I sure
exactly
did.
like you stole it off him.
Yeah. So, in fact, I heard Eddie Johnson complaining about that this summer, about me winning that thing. And I more or less forgotten it. Now, so there.
What are those things you invented?
Yeah, they would pull the strings up and down and change
Like
keys
Scruggs
with you.
tuners?
Well, that came out later, yeah.
So you had sort of the precursor to the Scruggs.
Yeah, oh no, they were not tuners, they were levers, rabbit ears.
I think I've seen those.
Yeah.
I've got, well, that's
Did you have a patent on that or anything?
No, I didn't have foresight to get a
Good.
patent. No. Worked 10 times better than those old buttons do. Anyway, that made 3 times that I had beat Larry Richardson in a banjo picking contest. And then it dawned on me what he'd said about beating Earl Scruggs. Well, I ran into James Hypes. He's a well-known connoisseur of bluegrass, a fiddle maker and all, and I went to see him down at Myrtle Beach, and we got to talking, and I said, James, I said, do you reckon there was anything to that story that Larry told about beating Earl Scruggs twice? And James said, yes, I was there. And he told the years it was, and Larry was with Bill Monroe, and Lester and Earl was there, and they had a little banjo picking contest. It was in the vicinity of Princeton, West Virginia, where it happened 2 summers in a row. But the funny part about it was, their bass player was talking to James Hypes one day later about it and said, Lester and Earl and the bass player got in the car after that last time Earl had lost. And they were going into North Carolina, and they'd driven for about an hour and a half, and nobody had spoken. And finally Earl said, Lester said, I don't think I'll ever enter another banjo picking contest. And Lester said, I don't believe I would if I was you either, Earl. And I don't guess Earl ever did. Now, that doesn't mean a thing in the world as far as who's the greatest banjo picker ever was. It just shows you something about Fiddler's Convention. That's what you asked me about to start with. Fiddler's Convention doesn't show you who's the best. It may show you who's had a good day or a good night. It may show you somebody who's, especially, they used to come up with gimmicks. The early Fiddler's contest, they'd play under their back, they'd play the fiddle behind their head, they'd play Pop Goes the Weasel under one leg and another, and do all this stuff, and win, had a crowd. You know, because a lot of the early Fiddler's Conventions had a sound meter, applause meter, and they went by that. That big fuss over Rolling My Sweet Baby's Arms I mentioned a while ago, I saw that thing from start to finish.
What was that?
Well, about half the books that's been published, and they're numerous, about half of them has Lester Flatt as the author. About half of them has Charlie Monroe as the author. And Lester Flatt played with Charlie Monroe 7 years. You see that poster right there on the back? Mm-hmm. That's Lester Flatt playing the mandolin in 1941 with Charlie Monroe. I've got the old albums too, where Lester Flatt was on there playing with Charlie Monroe. So here's what I know about Rolling My Sweet Baby's Arms. The song emerged during those years, but it didn't go anywhere. It just was forgotten. And Lester and Earl was finishing out needed one more selection on a Mercury, those old Mercury records they were doing, 78s. They needed one more, and Lester thought of it and did it. That preserved it, but it didn't make it a big time thing, and I don't know what made it a big time thing. They re-recorded it later on, and I have no idea what made it go so big. But suddenly, the Boston Pops and the top rock artists all over the world was playing Rolling My Sweet Baby's Arms, and it was bringing in millions of dollars. And when it started doing that, Lester and Charlie both thought back, and I believe both of them honestly felt like they may have worked on it together, you know, kind of thing, a co-op, you know, but each one sincerely felt when such emphasis came to that song that it was theirs. I saw Charlie Monroe open a check on Christmas of 1974 in his little house in North Carolina. that they had him living in Reedsville for $11,000. Buck Owens. And I mean, that song brought in millions. So naturally, they would be this strong emotions as to, I wrote that song, that's mine, I wrote that, you know. And I feel like, incidentally, let me interrupt that for a second. Charlie Monroe always thought he wrote Down in the Willow Garden, and he's credited with that in all kinds of books. He's the author of it. I got talking to a musicologist one day that had been searching in the British Isles, found that song went back about 200 years. And the only difference was some slight difference in the title. It wasn't willow, it was some other shrub or tree, but
some
it was
other garden.
Yeah. Now going back to this story, what I saw with my own eyes, we were playing at Lake Norman Music Hall in Lake Norman, right out of Charlotte, in 1974, and it was a big 3-day thing, and everybody was there. And that was the year I was helping Charlie again. I mentioned 74 to 75. Lester Flatt was down there. He had a band then called the Nashville Grass. Curly Seckler was playing a guitar with him. He used to play the mandolin with him, and Stewart. Marty Stewart was playing the mandolin and all that. It was a big 3-day thing. We was all there. On Sunday afternoon, we was doing our final shows. I was sitting on the front row with Charlie Monroe, sitting there together. Lester comes out to do his last show, looks down at Charlie and acknowledges that that's Charlie's song. And I thought Charlie was going to knock my leg off. See there? I never saw a man express joy so much. And Lester gave Charlie full credit. Lester said that song has made me more money than all of my other material put together. Lester did.
Now, how did that happen that they both are getting checks?
Because they both claimed it. Some people believed one, some people believed the other, and it never was settled, I guess, by law.
Doesn't just BMI do all that for you?
I think they didn't record it at the time. I don't think they...
Maybe that was before everything was either asked
It's just an independent publisher.
The publisher had to decide.
Maybe both of them published it or something.
See, this was back in the 40s, and like I said a minute ago, the song didn't go anywhere, and I don't think they did anything with it. That's my own personal thoughts about it.
Co-authorship and split it, maybe, but that's too easy.
But what the song wasn't no good then. I mean,
right.
But now, you know, focused on. So Lester's manager was not present when Lester said that on stage. But just as Lester was finishing out the song, Lester's manager showed up, and he went around, you know, across the stage getting a big hand for Lester, and then he runs up to the microphone and he says, "Thank you, ladies and gentlemen." Said that's made Lester more money than any song he ever wrote, and put it right back in turmoil again. And it stayed that way till they both died, but they did get friendly over it. I saw that happen there. In 1974, they got friendly over that song.